When Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence in 1776, he wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." 72 years after that declaration, in July 1848, a new declaration was issued from this site, the Wesleyan Chapel, declaring that all men and women are created equal. This is a story that the National Park Service preserves here at Women's Rights National Historic Park. Holding to the integrity of history, the National Park Service reminds all of the forgotten and untold stories in our nation's history, including the history that has left a blemish on our national narrative. The National Park Service protects Civil War battlefields, telling the stories of the fight between brothers over the issue of human slavery. At the Statue of Liberty, a greeting for immigrants often not welcomed to the United States. At Manzanar, internment camps in which Japanese Americans lived out World War II. At Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and the Selma to Montgomery Trail, the determination of Black citizens to gain education and voting rights. And at the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee people's forced removal from Indian country. And so, it is appropriate and an honor today for us to welcome Arun Gandhi. Arun Gandhi reminds all of the forgotten and untold story of Kastur, the wife of Mahatma Gandhi, the great soul. Kastur's side-by-side struggle. Kastur, who gave up a life of wealth for one of poverty, sacrificing much in the nonviolent struggle for equality. Today, in partnership with the Women's Interfaith Institute, we are honored to host Arun Gandhi. First, we'll hear from Alliston Stokes from the Women's Interfaith Institute. Again, thank you for coming and welcome to Women's Rights National Historical Park.
It's a joy to partner with the National Park in bringing Arun Gandhi to Seneca Falls. It's wonderful that you all are here to give him a warm welcome. Yesterday afternoon, Arun spoke at the high school to students from 8th through 12th grades, and they were extremely attentive in listening to him. You could hear a pin drop. Catherine Porter gave a wonderful introduction, and there were excellent questions. Afterwards, many students wanted to have their pictures taken with Gandhi's grandson. It was an historic happening, and this is an historic happening today, and we share the joy of it. Many people have thanked me for my role in making it possible to bring Arun here today, and I must say how incredibly fortunate and thankful I am to know and have worked with Arun. And I want to briefly tell the story of how this happened. Arun and his late wife Sunanda co-founded the MK Institute for Nonviolence in 1991. For many years, this was based in Memphis, Tennessee, and then in 2007, the Institute moved to the University of Rochester. They advertised for a director of the Institute, and after I applied, and after an interview with the committee and also with Arun himself, I was hired, and I served there in that capacity until 2009. It was incredible to me to witness Arun's commitment and his activity and his world travel in promoting nonviolence. For me, one of the most memorable happenings was a trip to Arezzo in Tuscany, Italy in October 2008. The Gandhi Institute was in dialogue with the Rondine Center in Arezzo, that Center for Peace, to explore a possible partnership. And there were talks and workshops and fellowship and good food. And Arun was invited to speak. I was invited too. And I saw up front and close Arun's impact on people, and especially students. Students were there from all over the world. At the University of Rochester, he was much beloved and admired by undergraduates and graduates alike. So it's been a great blessing that after my retirement from the U of R and in recent years, Arun and I have continued our friendship. I had the joy of attending his 80th birthday celebration at his daughter Archana's home in Rochester with other family members and with friends. It was wonderful. Arun will be 82 next month. He speaks and writes about his time with his grandfather, and most recently, 2 years ago, published this wonderful book, Grandfather Gandhi for Children. And now he himself is a grandfather and a great-grandfather. In 2007, Arun lost his beloved wife, Sunanda. Together, they were very creative in promoting the legacy of Mahatma Gandhi. They wrote a book together about Arun's grandmother, as Amy has said, The Forgotten Woman, and this, of course, is the subject of his talk this morning. Together, they instituted what is called a Season for Nonviolence. And because this is important, I want to say something briefly about that. You may want to ask Arun more questions in our time for questions later. The story is that in 1998, which was 50 years after the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi in 1948, and also 30 years after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, the UN invited Arun to help them observing these anniversaries. So Arun and Sunanda gave this event what they could do much thought, and they were very mindful of the influence that Gandhi had on King. And they came up with the idea of a season of nonviolence. It would begin on January 30th, the date of the assassination of Gandhi, and end on April 4th, the date of the assassination of King. The 64 days between January 30th and April 4th would be this season where participants, those who wanted to participate, could personally commit themselves to living nonviolently and working for peace. Arun and Sunanda thought that this season would be observed in 1998 only, but the idea was so special and intriguing that it is observed, has been observed ever since, and it's gone worldwide, the season of nonviolence. It's March 19th, so we are in the season of nonviolence. April 4th is just a little bit more than 2 weeks away. So I think it's especially fitting that Arun is with us now. He identifies himself as a peace farmer. A peace farmer. And in his talk this morning, he will tell you about what that means, why he's chosen that. He's devoted his life to promoting the principles of peace and nonviolence that his grandfather taught. He leads a yearly Gandhi Legacy Tour in India for over 2 weeks. And in August, a second children's book will be released, Be the Change. Finally, we know that Mahatma's message of nonviolent, peaceful change is strikingly relevant and desperately needed today. Before Arun comes forward, I want to share a sobering statistic just released by the Council on Foreign Relations. Last year, America dropped or fired at least 23,144 bombs and missiles. At least 22,000 hit targets in Iraq and Syria. Afghanistan was targeted at least 947 times. Please join me in welcoming Arun Gandhi.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning and to be able to share with all of you a little understanding of my grandmother, who was forgotten by history, and nobody had written anything about her at all. But before I begin with my talk, I thought I would like to suggest that the National Park Service needs to change its name to National Parks and People Service. They can deal with people also. But it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad that the National Park Service is part of this organization. I was in my late 20s, and when my wife and I realized that there were so many books written about my grandfather, but not one book about my grandmother. And I felt that she had played a very significant role in making him what he eventually became. I don't think he would have achieved that status if she had not cooperated with him in all his life and his work. And so my wife and I decided to do something about it, and we tried to find material on her life, and we found very little of it, very little written material, which was only what my grandfather referred to in his autobiography or his other writings. So we had to depend a lot on oral history, going and meeting people who had lived with her and known her and tried to get things out of their memory. And it took us many years to get all of this together and have enough material to write a book. And then I wrote the book, and nobody wanted to publish it. I offered it to publishers in India, in England, in the United States, and everybody rejected it, saying, you write about your grandfather and we'll publish it tomorrow, but this book, nobody's interested in your grandmother. And I said, no, I'm interested in my grandmother and I want to publish this. So I hung on to the manuscript for nearly 30 years, not finding anybody wanting to publish it. And now I think about it, and I think it's probably my grandmother's spirit that was prohibiting this kind of commercial publishing thing, because I think she wanted if this book was published, that it should serve the people and not just make profits for the publisher and for me. And so when I ultimately found somebody who was willing to print the book, it happened to be in Little Rock, Arkansas, of all the places. She had a little publishing house and she published books on metaphysics. And she said, this is the first time I'm venturing into a biography. If you want to take a chance, I'll do it for you. So I said, yes, at least it will see the light of day. And so she printed the book, but she didn't have the budget to publish it, to promote it and sell it. So there are no reviews of the book, no publicity of the book. But the book was published, or rather printed, in 1989. And since then, I've been selling the book wherever I go. And I think over the years, I've sold more than 50,000 copies. And everybody who's read the book have been surprised that no commercial publisher has been interested in this. They found it very interesting. The life of Kasturba was also very interesting. So I think my grandmother wanted the money raised from this to go to a worthy cause, a charity, rather than people making profits out of it. And so I have now dedicated all the profits from the sale of this book and the other book that I have, Legacy of Love, to supporting poor children. Eventually we want this to be a worldwide project, but right now we don't have enough money for a worldwide project, so I confined it to supporting the poor children in India. We have a lot of poverty in India, and many children grow up in poverty and they suffer a lot because they have to start working at the age of 4 and 5. And if they can't find work, they have to beg for food. I remember one incident when I was traveling by train in Bombay City, and I was reading a book, and I found somebody tugging at my trouser leg, and I looked down and it was a little kid. He was hardly more than 5 years old, dressed in rags, and very dirty and not had a wash or anything, coming from a very poor family. He had a little tin filled with homemade candy, and he was trying to sell the candy. And I was struck by this, because first of all, I wouldn't even dream of sending my 5-year-old kid all alone on a railway train in a city like Bombay, with so many people and the crowds and all that. And I wondered why is this kid going alone and selling sweets? So I asked him to come off the train with me because my station had to come, and I sat there and talked with him for a while, and I learned something that really shocked me. He said that every morning he is sent out by his parents with this tin full of candies that mother had made, with instructions to sell all the candy and bring the money home, and only then he would get something to eat. Until he sold all the candies, he couldn't eat anything. And this was about 5:36 in the evening, and he still had half a tin full of candy. And I asked him, I said, did you eat anything during the day? And he said, no, only what he could pick up, little scraps of food in the garbage. That was all that he could eat. And I wondered, when is this kid going to be able to eat anything? At 5:30, he still had half a tin full of candy. I could have bought the candy that day and given him the money. But that was not going to help him tomorrow, the day after. Who's going to do it every day? And that's when I realized that we need to do something more tangible, something more concrete for these kids. And so I started this program, and we now have more than 1,000 children who have been rescued and taken care of. And the sale of this book provides the fund for that program. But going back to my grandmother's story, she was a very powerful woman. She wasn't, unfortunately, she didn't have any formal education. She never went to school, but she educated herself through experiential education. She learned from everyday life and from her parents and from others. And she was a very brave and very wise woman. You probably know that both of them were married at the age of 13. And they were friends because they were living just 2 houses down the road. Their houses they were practically neighbors. And so they were playing together as little children. And then their parents decided that they would get them married at the age of 13. And they began to live together at the age of 16. And at that age, grandfather said he didn't know who was going to be the boss in the relationship. And so he started going to the library and reading books on the subject. And obviously all these books were written by male chauvinists. And they all talked about how the husband should lay down the rules and enforce them strictly. So he came home one evening and he told grandmother, he said, from tomorrow you are not going to stir out of the house without my permission. That is the law and you're going to obey it, and I want no arguments about it. And grandmother didn't say anything at all. She just quietly turned around and went to bed. And got up the next day and she continued to do what she always did. Continued to go out and visit and never bothered to get grandfather's permission. And so after a few days, when grandfather realized that she was not obeying him, he confronted her again and he said, how dare you disobey me? Didn't I tell you that you are not to stir out of the house without my permission? And at that point, very calmly, without raising her voice or getting agitated, very calmly grandmother says to him, I was brought up to believe that we must always obey the elders in the house. And I believe the elders in this house are your parents. And if you are trying to tell me that I should not obey your mother, but obey you instead, let me know so that I can go and tell your mother I'm not going to obey you anymore. And of course grandfather couldn't tell her to do that. And so the whole matter was settled without anybody losing their temper or creating a big scene. And grandmother acknowledges that that was the first and the most profound lesson in nonviolent conflict resolution that he learned from his wife. So she was a very brave person, very strong person, strong-willed. And my grandfather at that age was just the opposite. He was very fearful, he was afraid of the dark, he could not sleep in the room with the lights off, he had to have the lights on. And he couldn't understand how grandmother was so brave and didn't mind going anywhere in the dark. And I think that caused a little bit of jealousy in him. And that also played a little in their early relationship. But later on, they both realized, and grandmother also began to support him in his work. especially when they went to South Africa and faced all the apartheid and the prejudices there. If you'd seen the film Gandhi, you're probably aware of that scene in South Africa where my grandfather gets very angry with her for not emptying the chamber pot, and literally pulls her by the hand and takes her out of the house to the gate and said, "Get out of my house." Now that was a moment of real madness on grandfather's part, which he acknowledged later on. But that incident comes out of the prejudices that exist in India, the caste system. And grandfather didn't like the caste system. He said there's no religion in the world ever teaches anybody to oppress other people because of color or because of the kind of work that they do. The caste system comes out of the fact that in ancient India, and even today in many places in India, in the villages especially, we don't have modern sanitation facilities. We still have the primitive buckets, and those buckets have to be cleaned out by somebody and put in every day. And so there are a group of people who do this work. And because they do that work, they are paid very little. And because they are paid very little, they live in poverty, and they don't have a supply of water, and so they can't have a bath every day. And so they are considered untouchables. And for a long time now, several thousand years, this has been going on, and nearly 150 million people who do this kind of work have been considered untouchables and have been kept away from mainstream society. And grandfather wanted to get rid of this prejudice. And the only way he realized he could get rid of it was by doing that work yourself. And that's why he wanted grandmother to empty that chamber pot in the house. And she was not accustomed to this kind of thing, and she refused to do it. She was, she wanted to be convinced. She was not a pushover. She was not going to do it simply because grandfather said, "You've got to do this." She wanted to be convinced why it was necessary to do it and what the caste system involved and so on. And so later on, when she learned about this and understood the whole concept of it, then she agreed to do it and began to do it. But that was the first incident in her life when she was asked to clean a chamber pot used by somebody else, and she refused to do it. It only gave people the indication that she was a strong-willed person, because some people who have written a little about her in their biographies have always painted her as being a pushover, as somebody who just hung on to grandfather and that she didn't have any mind of her own or didn't have any plan of her own, that she was only following grandfather. And that's not true. She didn't have a mind of her own, and she was very brave. And there were instances in South Africa and even in India when there was this instance in 1942 when grandfather and the Congress Party passed a resolution asking the British to quit India, get out, we don't want you, we want freedom. And when that resolution was passed, the British authorities arrested all the leaders of the Congress Party and put them in prison. And so the second layer of leadership stepped in, and they went to read this resolution at a public meeting, and they were arrested. Eventually, there was nobody left who could go up and read, and grandmother said, "I'm here still. I'm not going to let this pass." And she went up onto the stage, and she read the resolution, and that's when the British government arrested her and locked her up in prison too. So this was in 1942, and both grandfather and grandmother were in prison up to 1944, when grandmother died. She died in prison because of ill health, and so her cremation took place in the prison compound, and today, the memorial is still there in the prison compound. Very few people know that she went to prison and served in prison and died in prison there. So this is a fascinating life of hers, and there are many more instances also of her bravery, her strength of character, and how she was able to handle issues, both everyday issues. There were simple things like when they were living in South Africa, and grandfather was very fond of eating at that time. He loved food, and especially a sweet pancake that we make in our part of India. And one day there were guests going to come for dinner at home, and grandmother decided to make these pancakes. And she was busy rolling out the pancakes and baking them. And grandfather walked in and he says, "Is this all you're going to make? This is only I can eat all this." And she said, "What do you mean? This is enough for the group of people who are coming." And he said, "I challenge you." He said, "I can eat all those pancakes myself." And grandmother said, "All right, let's see who wins then." And they took up the challenge, and grandfather wiped out all those pancakes. I don't know how he managed to eat nearly 20 pancakes. They're big pancakes too, round, big ones, but he consumed about 20 of them. And so grandmother had to cook a new batch of pancakes. But this was the kind of, fun aspects of their life, where they, had a lot of fun in their life too. Of course, after that incident, grandfather changed his life and his lifestyle and his eating habits and all of that. And later in his life, his food habits were so unimaginable and distasteful. I don't think anybody else could ever consume the kind of food that he was eating. We would just mix up all the mash in one pot and eat that. There was an Australian woman who once wrote to me and said that she wanted to observe grandfather's 75th birth anniversary with a banquet and invite all the people to eat the kind of favorite dishes that grandfather had. And she asked me for recipes of those dishes. And I told her, I said, if you cook what he ate, nobody is ever going to eat your food in the banquet. It was very simple, no salt, no spices, nothing at all, just all the vegetables put together and boiled and consumed. So taste didn't matter to him at all. It was just the nourishment that he wanted. And so if you buy this book, I'm sure you'll enjoy reading it. and you will be supporting a very noble cause also. And the book is available, I think, in the park services next door. So this is briefly what I wanted to share with you about grandmother, and I'm sure you have many questions. I'd be glad to answer them.
I promised that you would talk about Peace Farmer.
Oh, well, that's
We have a question.
Are there any landmarks in India?
any.
Are there any landmarks in India for your grandmother? Any memorial landmarks?
Yeah, there are statues in various places, and of course the house where she lived in is a small memorial there, where she was born, and the place where she died in the prison, that's a memorial place too. But Alison was talking about the Peace Farmer thing, and that was because when I lived with grandfather at the age of 12, I used to go to school, and one day I was coming back from school and I had this little 3-inch pencil in my hand, and I thought to myself, I deserve a better pencil, this is too small for me to use. And without a second thought, I just threw the pencil away, because I was so sure grandfather would give me a new pencil when I asked him for one. But that evening when I met grandfather and asked him for a new pencil, instead of giving me one, he subjected me to a lot of questions. He wanted to know how the pencil became small, and where did I throw it away, and why did I throw it away, and on and on. And I couldn't understand why he was making such a fuss over a little pencil until he told me to go out and look for it. And I said, you must be joking. He said, you don't expect me to look for a pencil in the dark? He said, oh yes, I do. Here's a flashlight. And he sent me out with a flashlight to look for this pencil, and I must have spent about 2 hours searching for it. And when I finally found it and brought it to him, he said, now I want you to sit here and learn 2 very important lessons. The first lesson is that even in the making of a simple thing like a pencil, we use a lot of the world's natural resources. And when we throw them away, we are throwing away the world's natural resources, and that is violence against nature. And the second lesson is that because in an affluent society we can afford to buy all these things in bulk, we overconsume the resources of the world. And because we overconsume them, we are depriving people elsewhere of these resources, and they have to live in poverty. And that is violence against humanity. And that was the first time I realized that all of these things that we do every day, consciously and unconsciously, things that we overconsume and destroy and throw away, that all of that constitute violence either against nature or against humanity. And to make me understand this thoroughly, he made me draw a genealogical tree of violence. Just as we would make a family tree with violence as the grandparent and physical violence and passive violence as the 2 branches. And every day before I went to bed, I had to examine and analyze everything that I had experienced during the day. Things that I may have done to other people, or people may have done to me, or things that I may have read about, whatever it was, everything had to be analyzed and examined and put in their appropriate places. If it was the kind of violence where we use physical force against one another, all the fighting and killing and kicking and beating and murders and wars and all of these things where physical force is used, that would go under physical violence. But if it's the kind of violence where we don't use any physical force, and yet we hurt people, directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously, our actions hurt people. And there are many things that we do every day that's become a part of our life that we enjoy, but it hurts people elsewhere. The overconsumption of things, the destruction of things, throwing away of things. I read in the New York Times not too long ago that in the United States alone, we throw away $160 billion worth of food every year. $160 billion worth of food goes down the drain every year, while there are millions of people in the country itself who go to bed hungry. And that is a very important form of passive violence that we commit. And we do this individually too. We often take more food on our plates than we need, and then we can't eat all of it, so we just throw away the rest of it. And it's not just the food, but so many other things we overconsume and destroy. So we need to do this introspection. And the reason why we need to do this introspection is that we have created a whole culture of violence that dominates our life. And that culture of violence is so pervasive that it affects our language, our relationships, our sports, our entertainment, our speech. Everything about us has become violent. And unless we find out how we practice violence in different ways in our own lives, we will never be able to make the change. And that's why he said that all of us need to do this introspection, find out the weaknesses in ourselves, and transform those weaknesses into strengths. And that's how we can become the change that we wish to see in the world. So, taking my lesson from that story, I realized that what we can do is just plant seeds. I go out and I speak to people and I plant seeds in their minds. And I hope and pray that those seeds will eventually germinate and we will have a whole group of peacemakers. And that's why I call myself the peace farmer. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
What do you think is the main source of most of the violence that we find in everyday life?
The main source of violence in everyday life is, I think, our lifestyle. We are so involved in our own selfish motives. Selfishness has become a keystone of our life. We are always thinking about ourselves and not about everybody else. And we want to get the biggest share of the pie or the most that we can get and the best that we can get. And so it's always selfish motivation, and that creates conflicts in people, because there are lots of people who we step on their toes unconsciously because we want to be successful. We do this as parents. We instill in our children that they have to be successful in life and not think about anybody else, think about yourself and get to the top by any means possible. So we plant those seeds of selfishness in our children right from the time they're little. And that then determines their course of life. And all of us are only thinking about, I want this and I'm going to get it by any means possible. And we never think about other people, and that's the tragedy.
I had one question, sir. I was born in 1968, way past like Mahatma Gandhi had passed away or was murdered. Like we picture him as, a person who's, wearing a loincloth and thin and frail. He was born in a family which was able to afford him to send to, study law in South Africa. His family was rich. So why did he choose to, turn into that? Can you please elaborate on that?
Yes, he did come from a fairly affluent family. I wouldn't say they were very rich, but they were well off. And he had enjoyed a good life. He studied law in England, and then he was retained by an Indian merchant in South Africa, where he eventually established a practice. And in those days, I'm talking about 1890s, in those days his practice was worth over 100,000 pounds, which is a huge amount in today's money. But he gave up all that when he saw the poverty in the world and how poor people are denied because we were better off. We consume much more than them. And so he adopted the clothes that the poorest person could afford to wear. And he said, if that poorest person can afford only this much, then I have no right to wear any more than that person. And that's how his garb changed. His lifestyle changed. He adopted total poverty. Whatever he owned, he gave away to the nation in his trust. His writings, his photographs, the copyrights of everything are all vested in a public trust. So even the family has no rights over anything there. If I want to write and quote something of his writings, I have to ask the trust for permission, like any other individual would have to do. So he really believed in his philosophy and gave up all the wealth that they had. Yeah.
Do you think you would have been able to give up everything if your grandmother also didn't eventually agree with it? Because if she made it difficult for him, would he have continued on with his way of life?
No, that's why I think she played a very significant role in his life. If she had not cooperated with him, he wouldn't have been able to achieve all the things that he eventually achieved. And so there is that incident in South Africa when they decided to leave South Africa and come back to India. The Indian community in South Africa decided to give them a lot of gold and diamond jewelry as a gift from the Indian community for the service that they had rendered. And grandmother took that, and grandfather said, no, we don't deserve this, we don't own it, and we can't keep it. There was a long argument between the two over it, and eventually grandmother realized what he was saying was right, and then she cooperated with him, and they used all those jewels to create a public trust that supported the Indian National Congress in South Africa. So she wasn't, like I said earlier, she wasn't a pushover. She wasn't somebody who you can say, grandfather doesn't want you to do this, so you mustn't do it. She wanted to know why, and she wanted to be convinced about it. And once she was convinced about it, then she was wholeheartedly supporting.
Because later on in life she went and did her own work sometimes in the various villages to help them with, sanitation and things like that. So she did it on her own too.
Right. She did a lot of work in India on her own, especially with the women living in poverty. She found in the state of Bihar, where they went to work among the poor people there, that the women sometimes couldn't come out of their homes because they just had one garment, the one sari to wear, and they had to share it with other women in the family. So one person could come out and the others couldn't. And so she began to get clothes from the richer friends and distribute them to these poor people. And she did a lot of work for poor women especially. Yeah.
When we lived in South Africa, there was already so much poverty, so much segregation where they were living in South Africa. Why go all the way back to India and not impact what's happening around their own community in South Africa? Was there any work done there?
Yeah, they lived there for 22 years, and they did begin some work in South Africa. Although much of their social work was overshadowed by the political work that they had to do simultaneously, because the Indians were not given rights and privileges in the South African society. And so he was fighting for that and fighting against apartheid and discrimination. So, you know, his attention was divided. But what he realized when he was in South Africa was that he would not get dignity and rights for his people in a foreign country if they didn't enjoy the dignity and rights in their own country. And so he said, I've got to go and liberate my people in India first before I can get rights for them in other countries.
Okay.
I have a question. Can you tell everyone how you ended up in Rochester, New York?
I was, as Alison said in the introduction, I started the institute in Memphis, Tennessee. And in 2004, my wife's health started deteriorating, and it became very difficult for me to take care of her and travel, because I was going out and speaking so much. And so my daughter, who lives in Rochester, she said, if you move to Rochester, I can help you take care of Mom. And so I decided to move, and I came to Rochester in 2004. And my wife died in 2007. And then my daughter said, I'm not letting you go anywhere. You've got to stay close to me. And so I'm stuck in Rochester. Not that I regret it. I'm happy to be close to my daughter. My son lives in India. So every year I go with the group on the Gandhi Legacy Tour, and I meet my son and grandchildren there. So it's a happy situation.
Question back there.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, how do you like the winter?
Well, it's not very pleasant. Not just the physical part of it, but like I said, I travel so much and I'm constantly in and out. And traveling in winter is a painful thing, because the first flights to be cancelled are the small flights coming into Rochester. And I often get stuck in somewhere in the middle, neither here nor there, and I have to sit in the airport all night waiting for another flight to get home. So that part of it is very painful, but otherwise winter is okay.
Was it hard for you to adjust to life in America?
Was it hard for me to?
Adjust to life in the United States?
No, I don't think so, because I've been living in 3 continents. I was born in South Africa and lived there for 22 years, and then I was forced to live in India because I went to India in 1956 after my father died. And the idea was that I would go and immerse his ashes and come back and be with my mom and my two sisters. But I had a severe attack of appendicitis and had to undergo surgery, and I fell in love with my nurse and decided to marry her. And the South African government wouldn't allow me to bring her back with me. I could come back as a citizen, but they were not willing to give her permission to come with me. And so I was forced to live in India. And I lived there for 30 years, and now I'm here in this country for nearly 28 years. I've lived everywhere and enjoyed it.
One of the other greatest leader of the world is Nelson Mandela, and he was influenced by your grandfather. Can you say something?
Yeah, there are many people around the world who are influenced by grandfather. None of them actually met him in person. Even Dr. King, who was influenced by him, and never met my grandfather. They were influenced by his writings and what they learned about his life and so on. There's a very interesting thing about both Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King. I remember Nelson Mandela as a young person coming into politics in 1952 in South Africa. And in 1952 was the first time that the Indian National Congress, the African National Congress, and the Colored People's Congress. In the South African context, the colored people are the mulattoes. And so all three of them had different political organizations. And all three of them decided to come together and launch a struggle against apartheid. And my father was part of that conference, and he got up to speak on nonviolence. And Dr. Mandela was a young Turk at the time, and he had all these young people around him. And he didn't like what my father was talking about, and he started rattling his teacup and made my father stop talking and get off the platform. So that was his understanding of nonviolence at that time. But then he transformed and changed when he was in prison, and he started reading Gandhi's writings and so on, and became a follower of Gandhi. In in Dr. Martin Luther King's case, he was influenced by his writings, and then the Montgomery bus boycott that took place in 1959 was a very non-violent struggle. And when the Indian government realized that the African people were using non-violence, they were invited to come to India and meet people who had worked with and lived with grandfather and learn the techniques of nonviolence directly from them. So Dr. King and his wife and family and several other civil rights leaders of the time, they all went to India, and they were guests of the government of India, so they were given VIP treatment, and they were taken around all the places in India. And they came to Bombay, and in Bombay there is a home which my grandfather used whenever he was in transit, and he would stop in Bombay, he would stay at that home, and it's called Mani Bhavan. And now after his death, that place has been converted into a museum and a library. And the room that he used for his work and where he slept is now kept as it used to be at the time. And they've made a glass wall where people can look into the room, but they don't go inside. And when Dr. King and his group came there, they saw the room, and Dr. King expressed the desire to go inside the room and sit in meditation for a little while. And so the director made an exception for him, and she said, I will allow you to go in, but not the rest of the group. They can go and do whatever else they want to do. So Dr. King dismissed them and told them, I'll catch up with you later on. You can do whatever you want to. I want to meditate here. So he went into the room and sat in meditation. And very soon it was time for them to close the museum and go home. And they were all waiting for him to come out from the room, and he didn't show any signs of coming out. And so the director went to him and said, when are you planning to come out? We want to close up and go home. And he said, I'm not coming out. I'm staying here the night. And she was aghast, and she says, how can you stay here? This is a museum. We don't have a place for you to sleep or, eat or anything. And he says, well, if Gandhi could sleep on the floor, I can sleep on the floor. If he could stay here, I can stay here. So I'm not going anywhere. Let's not argue about it. So they had to lock him up in the museum the whole night. And they all went home and came back the next day, and he was still there meditating. And he came out, I think, at about 10 o'clock in the morning. And he said, now I feel spiritually strong to go back and lead my people in nonviolent struggle. So that was the influence for him. Yeah.
How much time did you spend with your grandparents?
I spent off and on, we used to go to India whenever, every 2 or 3 years to go and visit the family. But the period that I remember distinctly, the period between the age of 12 and 14, the 2 years that I spent with him, and those were the last 2 years of his life. 1946 to 48.
Can you tell the story of how that happened? Why you were there?
Yeah. I was growing up in South Africa, and there was a lot of prejudice at the time in South Africa, and everybody seemed to hate everybody there. At the age of 10, I was beaten up by some white youths because they thought I was too black. And then a few months later, beaten up by some black youth because they thought I was too white. And I was filled with anger and rage, and I wanted eye for an eye justice. And it became such an obsession with me that I started going to the gymnasium and doing exercises and pumping iron so that I could be strong and be able to fight back again. And that's when my parents decided it's time to go to India and give me the opportunity to live with grandfather and learn something from him. And so they took me there and left me with grandfather, because my grandmother had died by then. And the first lesson that he taught me was about understanding anger and being able to use that energy constructively. He said anger is a wonderful emotion. It's a very powerful emotion. But what is wrong is that we abuse anger instead of learning to use it intelligently. He said anger is like electricity. It's just as powerful and just as useful, but only if we use it intelligently. But it can be just as deadly and destructive if we abuse it. So just as we channel electrical energy and bring it into our lives and use it for the good of humanity, we must learn to channel anger in the same way so that we can use that energy for the good of humanity rather than abuse the energy and cause death and destruction. Today we find that more than 85% of the violence that we experience in our personal lives or in the lives of our nation is generated by anger. We get angry and we blow up and we say things and do things that sometimes changes the course of our lives completely. And yet we don't have to do that if we learn how to use that energy constructively. I work in the prisons here in Groveland and Livingston prison, and it's full of young people who acted in a moment of madness, and now they regret it. But once you've done the act, there's nothing you can do to take it back again. So I think it's very important for all of us to learn that anger is not something we need to be ashamed of. Anger is something we need to learn to harness and use constructively and intelligently. Yes, ma'am.
So many people have been inspired by your grandfather, and I'm wondering if there was someone who inspired him.
Yes, I think there are many people in his life. Thoreau was one of them. Ruskin was another. Leo Tolstoy was one. And then, of course, in his life, he just was influenced by people. Anybody he met, and he always said that, we have to have an open mind, an open and absorbing mind. He said, your mind should be like a room with many open windows, and let the breeze flow in from all of them, but refuse to be blown away by any one of them. And so he kept an open mind, and he learned from people that he met every day, and was influenced by that. But the main people were the three I taught.
So folks, if there are not any further questions, we will have a book signing next door at the Visitor Center. We encourage you all to come and speak a little bit more with Arun.
Thank you.